Frankie Russo's hands were steady as a surgeon as he ran the straight razor along Al Capone's throat. 38 years cutting hair on the south side of Chicago. 38 years hearing things men shouldn't say out loud. 38 years knowing when to listen and, more importantly, when to forget. But today, Frankie Russo was holding on to a secret that could get him. And Al Capone, killed. 3 men had just walked into the barbershop. 3 men Frankie had never seen before. 3 men wearing heavy overcoats in early April when Chicago was already shaking off winter. And Frankie knew, the way every man in this neighborhood knew, exactly what those coats were hiding. The first man locked the front door. The second reached up and twisted the slats of the blinds shut, sealing the shop off from the street. The third stepped in close, directly behind Capone's chair. His hand slipped inside his coat, fingers curling around something cold, metallic, final, shot. Capone sat there with his eyes closed, a hot towel draped over his face, shaving cream still warm against his jaw, completely exposed, still, completely vulnerable. The click of a hammer being cocked sounded louder than a gunshot in the quiet room. "Don't move, Frankie," the man behind Capone whispered. "Just keep shaving. This ain't about you." Frankie felt his throat tighten. His razor hovered against Capone's skin. One bad twitch away from slicing a man who ruled half of Chicago. 3 against 1. Capone was unarmed, outgunned, trapped in a barber's chair. And then Al Capone spoke 3 words. Calm, flat, almost bored. "Closer, Frankie." What happened in the next 47 seconds would become one of the most whispered about moments in Chicago's underworld. 3 men walked into that barbershop. But when the smoke cleared, when the shouting stopped, and when the police sirens finally faded into the distance, only 1 man walked out, alive. And it wasn't any of the 3 with guns. What nobody knew, and what the streets still talk about in low voices to this day, is that Al Capone knew those men were coming before they even put on their coats that morning. To understand what happened in Frankie Russo's barbershop that afternoon, you need to understand who Al Capone was in 1931 and why certain men in Chicago had decided he needed to die, no matter the cost. By the spring of 1931, Al Capone had become something the rival outfits couldn't comprehend. A man they couldn't intimidate. A man they couldn't buy. A man they couldn't remove. Capone controlled liquor, gambling, protection, and labor rackets across Chicago. But that wasn't what made him dangerous. Plenty of men ran rackets. What made Capone untouchable was loyalty. When Prohibition shut down legitimate work, Capone kept entire neighborhoods fed. When families were evicted during winter, rent appeared on their doorsteps. When men came home from prison with no prospects, Capone found them real work, behind bars and warehouses and clubs that stayed open when everything else went dark. The other outfits ruled through fear. Capone ruled through obligation, and obligation runs deeper than fear ever could. By 1931, the North Side outfit had grown tired of watching Capone dominate the city unchecked. Money was bleeding east and west. Territories were shrinking. Pride was wounded. They tried hitting his trucks. They tried bribing judges. They tried squeezing his suppliers. Every move failed, so they tried something different. They hired outsiders, men with no Chicago ties, men with no faces Capone's people would recognize, men desperate enough to die for a payday. They found 3 brothers out of St. Louis. The Malone brothers, small-time muscle, big ambitions, nothing to lose. The deal was simple. $30,000, half up front, the rest when Capone was dead. Any place, any method. Just make sure Chicago woke up without him. The Malones took 4 days to study Capone's routine. They learned where he ate, where he drank, where he met his lieutenants, and then they learned something else. Something that made them smile. Every Thursday afternoon, without fail, Al Capone sat in Frankie Russo's barbershop on West Taylor Street. Same chair, Same time, same 2-hour ritual. For 2 hours every Thursday, Capone was predictable, stationary, human. Or so they thought. What the Malones didn't know, what nobody on the North Side knew, was that Al Capone lived by one rule that had kept him alive through wars, betrayals, and bloodshed. Trust no one completely, but know everything, absolutely everything. By Monday morning, Capone already knew their names. He knew where they slept. He knew who paid them. He knew what train they'd taken into Chicago. The bellhop at the Lexington Hotel mentioned 3 out-of-town boys asking too many questions. Bartender on Clark Street noticed unfamiliar faces nursing cheap whiskey while watching Capone's drivers come and go. Even the shoe-shine kid outside the courthouse had clocked the accents. Information moved faster than bullets in Capone's city. By Tuesday night, Capone sat alone in his office, above the Cicero Club. The windows cracked just enough to let cigar smoke bleed into the street below. Jack McGurn stood near the door, silent, waiting. 3 of 'em, McGurn said. St. Louis, Malone brothers. Not smart, just hungry. Capone nodded, eyes never leaving the dark glass. They always are. We can handle it now, McGurn added. 1 call, no mess. Capone finally turned. And then what? McGurn didn't answer. Capone leaned back in his chair. Then they send more. Different faces, different day, same problem. He tapped ash into a crystal tray. No, this one needs to be loud. Wednesday morning, Capone made his usual rounds. He shook hands, kissed babies, ate eggs at his regular diner like nothing in the world was wrong. That afternoon, he stopped by Frankie Russo's shop. Not for a shave, just to talk. Frankie was sweeping hair when Capone walked in. He froze for half a second, then relaxed. Boss, he said, chairs open. Capone shook his head. Not today. Frankie locked the door out of habit and flipped the sign to closed. Capone sat in his usual chair anyway. There's going to be trouble tomorrow. Frankie didn't stop sweeping. Police trouble or street trouble? Street, Capone said. Out-of-towners. Frankie swallowed. What do you need from me? Capone met his eyes in the mirror. I need you steady. When they come in, you keep cutting. When I say closer, you drop. Frankie hesitated only a second. You always come back alive, he said. I'll trust that. That night, Capone set the stage. 2 men across the street posing as deliveries. Drivers. 1 man in the apartment above the shop. And beneath the barber's chair, taped clean and tight, a small revolver most men wouldn't bother with. Thursday came. 2:30 p.m. on the dot. Capone walked into Frankie Russo's barbershop like he had every Thursday for years. The cape went on, the towel went hot. The razor began its slow, careful dance along Capone's jaw. At 2:47 p.m., the door opened. 3 men stepped inside, overcoats, hard eyes, hands that never stopped moving. The first locked the door. The second shut the blinds. The third moved behind the chair. Don't move, Barber, the youngest whispered. Just keep working. The gun pressed against the back of Capone's head. Frankie's hand trembled for half a heartbeat. Capone didn't flinch. I've been waiting for you since Monday, Capone said softly. The men froze. What? One of them said. You ask too many questions in my city, Capone continued. That's how I know. The gun pressed harder. You talk too much for a dead man, the youngest said. Capone smiled beneath the towel. Closer, Frankie. Frankie dropped. The towel fell. Capone's hand snapped under the chair. The first shot hit center mass. The second man went down screaming. The third turned too late. Glass exploded inward. Shotguns roared. Silence followed. 47 seconds. Capone stood, adjusted his cuffs, and looked at the 1 man still breathing. Go home, Capone said. Tell whoever sent you what you saw. The man crawled for the door. And tell him this, Capone added. Chicago don't bleed for nobody. Frankie Russo opened the shop the next morning. Same chair, same mirror, same razor. And Chicago understood. The story didn't spread fast. It spread correctly. By nightfall, bartenders were pouring drinks a little slower. Bookies lowered their voices. Drivers took longer routes through neighborhoods they didn't fully trust anymore. By morning, the phones on the north side, and no one wanted to answer them. The surviving Malone brother didn't stop shaking until he crossed state lines. He took the first train south, didn't look back, didn't collect the rest of the money. By the time he reached St. Louis, he was done with the life. He'd seen the look in Capone's eyes. That wasn't survival instinct. That was inevitability. Back in Chicago, Capone sat with his lieutenants the following evening. Jack McGurn, Frank Nitti, Paul Ricca, men who had spilled blood together and lived to count the money. "They won't try again," Nitti said. Capone nodded. "Not here." "And if they do?" Ricca asked. Capone poured himself a drink. "Then they didn't understand the lesson." The North Side outfit called an emergency sit-down 2 days later. Capone wasn't invited. He didn't need to be. The message had already arrived ahead of him. "Too much attention," one man said. "Too unpredictable," another argued. "Too many eyes watching now." When the meeting ended, no territory changed hands, no money exchanged. One decision was made: leave Capone alone. Thursday came again the following week. 2:30 p.m., Capone walked into Frankie Russo's shop like nothing had ever happened. Frankie draped the cape over his shoulders, hands steady again, razor sharp and clean. "You all right?" Frankie asked quietly. Capone smiled in the mirror. "I'm always all right." Frankie nodded. That was answer enough. Outside, the city moved on. Cars passed. Kids laughed. Life continued because it had to. But something had shifted. Men who once whispered Capone's name now fell silent when it was spoken. Not out of fear alone, but understanding. He wasn't just reacting anymore, he was deciding. Capone didn't last forever. No king does. But that afternoon in a small barbershop on the south side became part of his legend, long before history tried to simplify him into headlines and photographs. Because power isn't about how loud you are. It's about how quiet the room gets when you enter. And in Chicago, after that day, rooms went very quiet indeed. By early summer, the city had adjusted. Routes shifted. Meetings changed locations. Certain names stopped coming up in conversation altogether. Capone didn't need to remind anyone. The reminder already lived in their heads. What surprised his enemies most wasn't the violence. It was the restraint. Capone didn't follow the barbershop with a wave of blood. No sweeping crackdowns, no public executions. He let the absence of chaos do the talking. Men expected retaliation. What they got instead was stability, and stability made money. Frank Nitti handled day-to-day operations while Capone stayed visible but measured. He attended charity events, sat courtside at boxing matches, shook hands with aldermen who pretended they didn't know exactly who he was. Every appearance said the same thing without a word spoken. "I'm still here." The surviving Malone brother tried once to tell his story. A few drinks too many in a St. Louis bar. A half-whispered warning about Chicago in a barber's chair. No one laughed. No one asked follow-up questions. They paid their tab and left him alone with his memory. Back on West Taylor Street, Frankie Russo kept a routine just as strict as Capone's. Same opening time. Same chair placement. Same mirror polished. Until it caught every angle of the room. He never removed the small chip in the floor where a bullet had struck. Customers noticed it sometimes. Frankie always said the same thing. Old building. Floors settle. The truth didn't need telling. Every Thursday at 2:30, Capone came in, and every Thursday nothing happened. That was the point. Men with power show it once. Men with control never have to again. Capone understood that better than anyone in Chicago. He didn't survive this long by being the loudest man in the room. He survived by making sure everyone else did the math before opening their mouths. Because once you understand the cost, you stop asking questions. And Chicago had done the math. Time did what bullets couldn't. It softened the edges of the story without ever dulling the meaning. By the fall of 1931, the barbershop incident had settled into something more permanent than rumor. It became a reference point, a line men measured themselves against. Whenever a new face came into Chicago with big ideas and bigger mouths, someone older would pull them aside and say just enough. Ask around about the barber. That was usually enough. Capone never corrected the story when it grew. He never confirmed details either. Some versions said he smiled the entire time. Others swore he never raised his voice once. A few claimed he let one of the gunmen live on purpose, just to make sure the message traveled. Capone didn't care which version survived, only that it did. In private, he was already thinking 3 steps ahead. Federal pressure was tightening. Accounts were being watched. Judges were suddenly interested in tax records instead of territory lines. Violence, Capone knew, wasn't the threat anymore. Attention was. That understanding was what separated him from the men who would replace him one day and die, wondering where they went wrong. One quiet afternoon, months later, Capone sat alone in Frankie Russo's chair while rain tapped against the front window. No guns, no tension, just the sound of scissors and the city breathing outside. "You ever think about stopping?" Frankie asked carefully. Eyes locked on the mirror. Capone considered it. "Every man stops," he said finally. "Just depends who decides it." Frankie nodded. He didn't push. That was another reason Capone trusted him. Outside the shop, Chicago moved forward. New rackets rose, old ones collapsed. Names changed, faces didn't. But the CLH balance held longer than anyone expected, because once fear is replaced with certainty, chaos loses its grip. The barbershop was still there. The chair was still there. And every Thursday without fail, Capone kept the appointment. Not because he needed to, because he wanted the city to remember that he could. And it did. By winter, the newspapers had moved on. They always did. Headlines chased scandals, elections, bodies found in alleys that didn't change the balance of anything. Capone's name still appeared, but less often. That was by design. The louder the paper got, the quieter Capone became. He let Frank Nitti handle the noise. He let lawyers handle the courts. He let the city believe it was calming down on its own. But under the surface, nothing was accidental. Every Thursday remained untouched. Drivers rotated, routes shifted. But the barbershop stayed sacred. Men noticed. Young soldiers asked why. Veterans told them not to ask questions they didn't want answered. Power, they learned, wasn't always where the guns were. Sometimes it was where the guns never came anymore. Frankie Russo aged quickly that year, not from fear, from understanding. Once you see how close the edge really is, every quiet day feels borrowed. One afternoon, a kid no older than 17 sat in the waiting chair too long. Eyes too sharp, hands too still. Frankie felt it immediately. Capone felt it too. "Who you waiting on?" Capone asked without turning. The kid swallowed. "Just a cut." Capone met his eyes in the mirror. "Shop's closing early." The kid stood, nodded, and left without another word. Frankie exhaled only after the door shut. "You didn't even look at him," Frankie said. Capone smiled faintly. Didn't have to. That was the thing about reputation once it hardened. It worked faster than instincts. By the end of the year, the barbershop story had crossed state lines. It reached Detroit, Cleveland, Kansas City. Not as a threat, but as a lesson passed quietly from man to man. Don't rush, don't assume, and never mistake routine for weakness. Capone never said those words. He didn't need to. They were already understood, because 3 men once walked into a barbershop thinking time was on their side, and Chicago never let them forget how wrong they were. The year turned quietly. 1932 arrived without ceremony, without gunfire, without the kind of chaos men expected when power began to shift. That alone made people nervous. Capone noticed. Men stopped arguing at meetings. Disputes resolved faster. Numbers came in clean. Nobody tested boundaries anymore. That was good for business, but dangerous for complacency. Capone had seen it before. When fear fades into comfort, someone always mistakes it for weakness. One night, well past midnight, Capone stood alone on the balcony of his Cicero house, the city stretching out beneath him like a living thing. Jack McGurn joined him, offering a drink. "They're scared again," McGurn said. Different kind this time. Capone took the glass but didn't drink. Scared men make mistakes. And comfortable men, Capone finally sipped. Comfortable men forget. That was why he never broke the routine. Even with federal agents circling, even with indictments whispering his name, even with the walls slowly closing in, Thursday stayed Thursday. The barbershop. Frankie Russo never asked about the newspapers. Capone never mentioned court dates. The chair remained neutral ground, untouched by the rest of the world's noise. One afternoon, Frankie finally spoke what he'd been holding back for months. "You know they're not going to stop coming," he said carefully. "Not the street guys. The other ones." Capone nodded. "I know." "And you still sit here." Capone met his eyes in the mirror. "Because this is where I remind them who I am." Frankie understood then. This wasn't about safety. It wasn't about defiance. It was about identity. If Capone stopped showing up, the city would assume something had changed. And Capone never let the city assume anything. Outside, snow began to fall, dusting the street white, quieting the world. A few pedestrians passed the window, unaware they were walking past one of the most deliberate statements of power Chicago had ever seen. Inside, the razor moved slowly, without fear. And for another Thursday, nothing happened, which was exactly how Capone wanted it. Spring crept back into Chicago like it always did. Slow, cautious, testing the ground before committing. Capone felt the shift before the city did. Federal pressure was no longer background noise. It was structure, paperwork, ledgers, quiet men in clean suits who didn't drink, didn't threaten, didn't blink. They didn't care about barbershops or territory. They cared about numbers that didn't add up. And numbers, Capone knew, were harder to intimidate than men. Still, Thursdays stayed untouched, not out of stubbornness, out of principle. One afternoon, as Frankie finished a trim, Capone caught sight of his own reflection, older than the man who'd first sat in that chair years ago. He wasn't slower. He wasn't weaker. But he was sharper in a different way now. Survival wasn't about winning every fight. It was about choosing which fights mattered. "You ever think they'll tell this story wrong?" Frankie asked, brushing loose hair from Capone's collar. Capone smirked. "They already do. They make you sound bigger than life." Capone stood, adjusted his coat. "That's fine. Bigger things cast longer shadows." Outside, a black sedan idled across the street longer than necessary. Capone noticed it. Always did. He didn't react. Reactions fed stories. Silence starved them. The car eventually pulled away. Another test. Another answer. By summer, indictments started landing around him like distant thunder. Not on Capone directly, not yet, but close enough to feel the vibration. Men disappeared into courtrooms instead of alleys. Deals dissolved on paper instead of in blood. Chicago was changing. Capone wasn't blind to it, but he didn't retreat. Thursday after Thursday, he sat in that chair, letting the city watch him, remain exactly where he'd always been, not hiding, not fleeing, just existing on his own terms for as long as the clock allowed. Because power isn't measured by how long you rule. It's measured by how much of yourself you refuse to give up before the end. And Capone wasn't done refusing. The city felt heavier now, not louder, not bloodier, just heavier, like everyone could sense the clock ticking, even if no one knew exactly when it would strike zero. Capone felt it most clearly on Thursdays. The walk to the barbershop hadn't changed, but the looks had, not fear anymore, not admiration either, something closer to acknowledgement, like people were watching the final act of a play they already knew the ending to, but still needed to see performed. Frankie noticed it too. "You're quieter lately," he said one afternoon, trimming the edges with care. Capone shrugged. "Less to say." The razor moved. The mirror reflected two men who understood something without naming it. This place had outlived violence. It had outlived threats. Now it was simply standing. That mattered. Federal men still circled. Papers still stacked up. Courtrooms waited patiently, confident in their own kind of power. Capone didn't rage against it. Rage was for men who hadn't thought things through. He focused instead on legacy, not the headlines, not the myths. The lesson that a man could be surrounded, outgunned, and still dictate the terms of the moment if he understood timing better than his enemies. That fear could open a door once, but certainty kept it closed forever. One Thursday after the shave was finished and the cape removed, Capone didn't stand right away. He stayed seated, eyes on the mirror, breathing slow. "Frankie," he said. "When people tell this story," Frankie paused. "Yeah? Make sure they remember this part," Capone said. "Not the guns, not the blood." Frankie waited. The calm. He stood, straightened his coat, and left a few bills on the counter, same as always. Outside, Chicago kept moving. Inside, the chair stayed exactly where it had always been, and the story began to settle into something permanent. The newspapers would eventually tell their version. They would talk about courtrooms and indictments, about tax charges and prison numbers. They would reduce Al Capone to headlines, photographs, and a single ending, as if a life like his could be boxed in by ink and dates. But the streets remembered something else. They remembered a barbershop on the South Side. They remembered a chair that never moved. They remembered a Thursday afternoon when 3 men walked in, believing power was measured in guns, and they remembered how wrong those men were. Frankie Russo kept cutting hair long after Capone was gone, long after the trials, long after the city found new names to fear and new stories to whisper. The mirror stayed. The chair stayed. The floor was replaced, but Frankie never forgot where the bullet mark used to be. Sometimes a customer would ask about it. Frankie would shrug and say, "Old building." That was enough. The truth didn't need explaining, because the story of that barbershop was never really about violence. It was about vision. Al Capone understood something most men never learn, even at the end of their lives. True power isn't about what you do when you're threatened. It's about what your enemies believe you'll do before they ever try. It's about being 3 steps ahead while everyone else is still counting weapons. It's about turning an ambush into a statement. It's about letting the world walk straight into the lesson you prepared for it. 3 men walked into that barbershop thinking they had the advantage. They had the numbers, they had the guns, they had the element of surprise. But Capone had already decided how the moment would end. He had let them come, and Chicago understood. If this story got you hyped, hit that subscribe button. We're dropping these Al Capone stories every week, and they only get darker, sharper, and more unbelievable. Drop a like if you understand why the barber was the only man who walked out untouched. And tell me in the comments, would you have let 1 man live just to carry the message? Next time, we're telling the story of how Al Capone walked unarmed into a room full of rivals and walked out with the city still in his hands. Remember this: in Chicago, respect wasn't given, it was earned.